The velvet box felt like a stone in her reticule, cold and impossibly heavy. Each jolt of the carriage on the rutted lane to Wycliffe Park seemed to send its weight through her, a dense, miserable reminder of why she was here. Eleanor Ainsworth kept her back straight, her hands folded over the small bag in her lap, and her gaze fixed on the blur of autumn-stripped trees outside the window. To look at her, one might have seen a model of composure. Inside, a storm of humiliation and resolve raged. It had been a week. A single week since Lady Danbury's ball, since the whispered lie had been seeded and bloomed into a full-blown scandal with the speed of a hothouse flower forced under glass. A week of her father's frantic pacing, her mother's silent tears, and the averted gazes of people who had, a fortnight ago, courted her company with almost fawning enthusiasm. The fiancé of the Marquis of Wycliffe was a person of consequence, a ruined debutante. Even one whose ruin was a fiction was not. She had been seen, the story went, slipping away from the ball into the gardens with Lord Ashworth. A clandestine meeting, a secret understanding. The fact that she had been in the ladies' retiring room with a splitting headache, attended by a maid, was an inconvenient detail no one wished to hear. The fact that Lord Ashworth was a harmless dandy who would know one end of a clandestine meeting from the other was equally irrelevant. The story was juicier than the truth. It had wings. And it had flown directly to every drawing-room in London, and, undoubtedly, here, to the Marquis's remote estate. Eleanor had borne the whispers and the cuts, with a practiced stillness she had learned over years of being the quiet, observant daughter. But she would not bear being a stain upon the name of a man who had offered her nothing but quiet, startling courtesy. The engagement was an impossibility now. An alliance with her would tarnish him, and worse, tarnish the future of his young daughter. The world expected her to fade away, to retreat to the country in disgrace. Instead, she had insisted on this journey. She would end it herself, cleanly and with dignity. She would return his ring. The carriage rounded a final bend, and Wycliffe Park appeared, a severe and beautiful house of grey stone that seemed to rise organically from the rolling hills. It was not a place of fashionable elegance, but of ancient, rooted power. It suited him. Everett, Lord Wycliffe, was a man carved from the same solid, unyielding material. A widower of 10 years, a man who had inherited his title too young under the shadow of his own parental loss. He had seemed to her a figure of immense solitude. Theirs was not a love match, not in the romantic sense. It was an arrangement of sense and suitability. He needed a mother for his silent, watchful daughter, Alice, and a marquis needed a wife. She, at 24, was deemed sensible, well-bred, and possessed of a quietness that he seemed to find restful rather than dull. He had looked at her during their formal courtship, not as if she were a prize to be won, but as if she were a puzzle to be understood. He noticed things, the one time her voice had wavered when speaking of her late grandmother. The way she always straightened the books on any table she passed. He had commented on it once, his voice low and devoid of flattery. A you-like order. It was not a question. It was an observation, and it had felt more intimate than any compliment. Now, that quiet understanding was surely shattered. The carriage drew to a halt before the grand entrance. A footman, his face a perfect mask of professional deference, opened the door. The air was cold, smelling of damp earth and wood smoke. It was the smell of an ending. Eleanor stepped down, her boots sinking slightly into the gravel. She clutched her reticule tighter. The stone inside it seemed to grow heavier, a tombstone for a future that had never truly begun. The butler, a man whose face seemed to have been starched along with his collar, met her in the vast, echoing hall. The fires were lit in the great hearths, but they did little to warm the sheer volume of space. Cold emanated from the stone flags underfoot, from the high, shadowed ceilings, from the portraits of long-dead ancestors who watched her progress with painted, indifferent eyes. "A Miss Ainsworth," the butler, Mr. Finch, said. His voice was perfectly neutral, yet she felt 1,000 judgments contained within it. His lordship is expecting you in a library. Of course he was. An execution was a private affair. She followed the ramrod straight, back of the butler, down a long gallery. Her own reflection flashed in the tall windows, a pale, determined face beneath a sensible bonnet. She looked like a governess arriving for an interview, not the woman who was, for a few moments longer, the intended lady of this house. The lie was a thing of whispers, but its consequences were as solid as these stone walls. Our girl is ruined. The airy, pitying voice of her aunt echoed in her mind, a cruel intrusion. It had been the soundtrack to her week. The library doors were imposing, two vast panels of dark, polished oak. Finch opened one and stood aside. "A Miss Ainsworth, my lord." She took a breath, the cold air stinging her lungs, and stepped inside. The room smelled of leather, old paper, and the lemon polish the maids used on the wood. A fire crackled in a hearth, large enough to stand in, casting a warm, dancing light across shelves that soared to a gilded ceiling. And there, standing by the window with his back to her, was the Marquess Everett. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, and his stillness was as much a part of him as the severe cut of his dark coat. He did not turn. "Leave us, Finch," he said. His voice was low, resonant. It held a quality of command that was not conscious, but simply innate. The door clicked shut, the sound unnervingly final. They were alone. The silence stretched. Eleanora's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage of whalebone and linen. This was it, the final act of her disgrace. She had rehearsed the words 100 times in the rocking carriage. "My lord, I have come to release you from our engagement. The circumstances, as you must know, make it impossible. I am returning this, with my deepest regrets for the dishonor this has brought upon your name." She forced her feet to move, her shoes making no sound on the thick Persian carpet. She stopped a respectable distance from him. She could see the gray light from the window silvering the edges of his dark hair. He was looking out at the gardens, now a tapestry of muted browns and golds. My lorda," she began, her voice a little unsteady. She cleared her throat and reached for her reticule, her fingers fumbling with the clasp. He turned then slowly. His face was as she remembered it, handsome in a severe, angular way. His eyes, a deep, thoughtful gray, were fixed on her. There was no anger in them, no pity, nothing but an intense, unnerving watchfulness. He looked from her face down to her hands, which were now withdrawing the small velvet box. This was the moment. "The precipice. Before you speak. Miss Ainsworth," he said, his voice quiet but carrying an immense weight that filled the room. Before you say what you have traveled all this way to say, and before you open that boxa, my answer is no." Eleanor froze. Her fingers were still on the lid of the box. The words she had so carefully prepared died in her throat. The silence rushed back in, but this time it was different. It was not empty. It was charged with his refusal. "I do not understand," she managed to whisper. He took a step toward her, then another. He was close enough, now that she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the unyielding set of his jaw. He did not look at her as a man looks at a disgrace. He looked at her as he always had, as if she were the only person in the room worth observing. "You have come to return my ring," he stated. It was not a question. "You have come to break our engagement because of a malicious and transparently foolish lie being circulated by fools and gossips." He stopped directly in front of her. His gaze dropped again to the box in her hand. Will not accept it. The engagement stands." Her breath caught. Of all the scenarios she had imagined it, cold dismissal, pained regret, even veiled accusation this had not been one of them. He was refusing to let her go. He was choosing to stand with her in the middle of the fire. Buddy, your name," she stammered, the words feeling clumsy and inadequate. Your daughter. I will not bring this scandal to your house." "It is not right." What is not right?" he said, his voice dropping even lower, becoming a firm private declaration. Ah is allowing liars to win. What is not right is sacrificing a good and sensible thing to the whims of bored, cruel people. He reached out, not to take the box, but to gently close her fingers back over it. His touch was brief, but it sent a jolt of warmth through the chill that had settled deep in her bones. Ah, so. No. Keep it. A title-worthy line. I will not accept it. The engagement stands. She looked down at her own hand, now held fast around the velvet box, and then back up at his face. The composure she had so carefully guarded for a week finally fractured. She felt a tremor run through her, a dizzying combination of shock and a strange, terrifying flicker of hope. He was not rescuing her from a position of power. He was stepping down into the mud beside her and refusing to let her stand there alone. The library, which had seemed so cold and imposing, suddenly felt like a sanctuary. The firelight seemed warmer, the shadows less menacing. For the first time in a week, someone had looked at the ruin of her reputation and had not believed it. But this was not a fairy tale. This was a man of immense standing, and she was, in the eyes of the world, damaged goods. His defiance would not erase the stain. It would only draw more attention to it. You cannot mean this, she said, her voice regaining a fraction of its strength. You are the Marquess of Wycliffe. You have a duty to your name, to your daughter. Tying yourself to me now, it would be an act of madness. Perhaps, he said, and the corner of his mouth tilted in a faint, wry smile that did not quite reach his eyes. But I have found that the world's definition of sanity is often lamentably narrow. I do not care for the opinions of fools, Miss Ainsworth. I care that you came here yourself. To face this, most would have hidden. He saw her courage. He was naming it. It was the thing she had her entire life believed was invisible to everyone but herself. Plain moral courage. He had seen it, and he valued it more than an untarnished reputation. The magnitude of his decision settled upon her. He was offering her not just a reprieve, but a partnership, in defiance, and that required more of her than simply accepting. It required her to be his equal in that defiance. Then if we are to do this, she said, her voice suddenly clear and steady, if I am to keep this ring, it will not be as a woman you are shielding out of pity. I will not be a secret you are ashamed of, hidden away in the country. We do this in the open, and we do it on my terms as well as yours. His eyebrows lifted, a fractional change in his guarded expression. He had expected her to argue, perhaps to weep with relief. He had not, she thought, expected her to negotiate. Your terms, he prompted, his gaze sharp, curious. Yes. She straightened her spine, meeting his eyes without flinching. The balance of power had shifted. He had given her an opening, and she would walk through it not as a supplicant, but as a future partner. A first. You will tell me you believe me, not that the gossip is foolish, not that the liars are cruel. You will look at me and tell me that you know I am innocent. This was the heart of it. She needed to hear the words. She needed to know his faith in her was absolute, not just a strategic dismissal of their enemies. He held her gaze for a long, silent moment. The fire crackled, the only sound in the room. She could feel the weight of his scrutiny, not as a judgment, but as a deep and serious consideration. I know you are innocent, Eleanor, he said, using her given name for the first time. The sound of it in his quiet, firm voice was a revelation. I have never for a moment believed otherwise. A woman who straightens books she has no intention of reading is not a woman who conducts clandestine affairs in gardens. It was the most unexpected, and therefore the most convincing, declaration she could have imagined. He had remembered that small, nervous habit. He had filed it away and understood it for what it was, a need for order, a quiet expression of an inner life that did not seek chaos. A wave of relief, so profound it almost buckled her knees, washed over her. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding a second. She continued, pressing on before the emotion could overwhelm her. Your daughter, Alice? I will not be forced upon her as a replacement for her mother. I will not enter this house and demand her affection. Her mother's memory will be honored. Her place in this house, her portraits, her things, they will remain. I will earn Elisa's trust, if I can, on my own. But I will not do it by erasing the woman who came before me. This was a risk. Many men, especially men so long widowed, wished to move on, to pack away the past. But she had seen the locket Alice always wore, a small, fiercely guarded treasure. She had heard the whispers from servants about the child's devotion to her mother's memory. To try and replace Lady Wycliffe would be to declare war on the child. Everetta's face, which had been so guarded, softened almost imperceptibly. A flicker of something pained and raw moved in the depths of his gray eyes. My late wife was a good woman," he said, his voice quiet, as she was the heart of this house. Erasing her would be a desecration. I would not ask it of you. In fact, you're saying that it confirms my judgment. He was a man frozen in grief. She was offering not to thaw him, but to respect the ice. And in that, she had touched the very core of his wound. And third, Eleanor said, her voice dropping, I will not be treated as a piece of porcelain you have rescued. I will have a role in this household. I will not sit in drawing rooms and embroider while the world whispers. If I am to be the future Marquis of Wycliffe, I will begin to learn what that means. I will not be decoration. She had laid her heart bare. She had demanded respect, trusted his grief, and claimed her own agency. She had given him every opportunity to retract his offer, to decide she was too difficult, too demanding. He was silent for a long time, his gaze distant, as if he were looking at a future she had just sketched out, and weighing its substance. She braced herself for his refusal. It had been too much to ask. At those, he said at last, bringing his eyes back to hers, are not the terms of a rescued woman, Miss Ainsworth. They are the terms of a partner. And they are precisely what this house, and my daughter and I, have been in need of for a very long time. He gestured to one of the high-backed chairs near the fire. Now sit down. You have had a long journey. We have a great deal to discuss. She sank into the chair, the velvet box still clutched in her hand. It no longer felt like a tombstone. It felt like a key. She had come to Wycliffe Park to surrender, to end a chapter of her life in honorable defeat. Instead, she had been met with an impossible choice, a shared defiance. She was to keep the ring. She was to stay. And the real battle, she understood with a clarity that was both frightening and exhilarating, was only just beginning. Eleanor's new life at Wycliffe Park began not with a bang, but with a profound and unnerving quiet. She was installed in a suite of rooms in the East Wing, rooms with tall windows that looked out over the formal gardens, now sleeping under a thin blanket of morning frost. They were beautiful rooms, furnished with elegant but slightly faded silks and rosewood furniture that smelled faintly of beeswax. They were also undeniably the rooms of a guest. She was the fiancée of the Marquess, a woman of standing within these walls. And yet, she felt her position was as precarious as the thin layer of ice on the ornamental pond. The staff treated her with a flawless, impenetrable courtesy. Mr. Finch, the butler, oversaw her comfort with the same grave efficiency he would afford a visiting dignitary. Her maid, a young girl named Sarah, with perpetually startled eyes, laid out her gowns and drew her baths in nervous silence. They were watching her. The whole house was watching her, waiting to see if she would break, if the scandal would follow her here and prove too much, if the Marquess's strange loyalty would finally falter. And then there was Alice. The child was a ghost in her own home, a small, silent creature of 8 years, with her father's solemn gray eyes and a cascade of dark hair she kept severely plaited. Eleanor would see her across the vast expanse of the breakfast room, eating her toast with a delicacy that was almost painful to watch, her gaze fixed on the plate before her. She would hear the whisper of her slippers in the long galleries, always vanishing around a corner just as Eleanor approached. She was a presence defined by her absence. Alice's governess, a harried-looking woman named Miss Gable, seemed utterly defeated by the child. "As she will not speak of it, Miss Ainsworth," the woman had confessed in a hushed, desperate tone, when Eleanor had gently inquired about her mother. "About anything, really. She does her lessons, she is obedient, but it is like speaking to a doll. Her father, his Lord Shepa, he does not know how to reach her. No one does." Eleanor knew better than to try. Forcing a lock only breaks the key. So, she adhered to the terms she had set. She did not intrude. She did not press for conversation or demand acknowledgement. She simply existed in the same space, a quiet, steady presence. When she entered a room where Alice was, she would offer a "Good morning, Alice," and then move on. Not waiting for the reply that never came, she began to learn the rhythms of the house. The deep, resonant chime of the grandfather clock in the hall that governed the day, the hour her father-in-law to be spent alone in his study after dinner. A ritual no one disturbed. The way the late afternoon sun would slant through the library windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air like tiny, silent stars. It was in the library that she found her first foothold. The room was Everetta's sanctuary, but he had made it clear it was to be hers as well. It was a magnificent collection, but she saw with her organizer's eye that it was in a state of gentle chaos. Books were misshelved, stacks of new acquisitions were piled on tables, and the cataloging system was years out of date. "My late father's passion," Everett explained one evening, finding her running a hand over a dusty set of leather-bound poets. "My own has been a less focused. May I?" she asked, her voice quiet. May I try to bring it to order? It would give me something useful to do." He looked at her, a long, considering look. She was not asking for a bauble or a distraction. She was asking for work. She was holding to her third condition. She would not be decoration. "The library is yours to command, Miss Ainsworth," he said, and so it became her territory. She spent her days there, dressed in a simple, practical gown, her hair tied back. She found the old ledgers and began the monumental task of creating a new, logical catalog. It was methodical, soothing work. The scent of old paper and leather was a balm to her frayed nerves. The quiet, focused labor kept the whispers of London at bay. He would often find her there when he returned from his rides about the estate. He would not interrupt, but would stand for a moment in the doorway, simply watching her. He noticed the smudge of ink on her finger, the focused line of her brow, the small, satisfied sigh she would let out when a particularly chaotic shelf was finally brought to order. He noticed her, and in his quiet observation, she felt seen in a way that was more profound than any public declaration. Their conversations were spare, but they began to build a delicate bridge between them. He would speak of the estate of the tenants in the village, struggling with a poor harvest. He spoke of it with a deep, weary sense of duty. He was a man, shackled to his responsibilities. "The village looks to Wycliffe for everything," he told her one afternoon, his gaze on the distant cluster of cottages, visible from the library window. When the harvest fails, they feel it. When the winter is hard, they suffer. My father believed a title was a contract, signed with the land and its people." "Ah, and you?" she asked softly. "I." Leafy was right, he said. "I. It is a heavy contract to bear. Alone." The words hung in the air between them. Alone. It was the first crack in his formidable armor, a glimpse of the lonely man beneath the Marquis's title. One afternoon, deep in the cataloging, she found a small, slim volume of pressed flowers tucked away behind a row of theological texts. The inscription on the inside cover was in a delicate, feminine hand, "For my dearest Everett. So you may have a garden in winter, all my love, Lenora." Lenora, his late wife. Her heart gave a painful throb. This was a piece of the love story that had ended, a secret treasure. She gently closed the book and instead of hiding it away, she placed it on the small table beside the chair he always favored. She did not mention it, she simply left it there for him to find. That evening, he came into the library and saw it. He stopped, his hand hovering over the small book. Eleanor, sitting at the large desk, pretended to be absorbed in her ledger, but she watched him from the corner of her eye. She saw his shoulders tense, saw him trace the letters of the title with one finger. He stood there for a long time, his back to her. When he finally turned, his face was unreadable, but the air in the room had changed. "A thank you, he said, his voice rough. It was all he said, but it was enough. She had not erased his past. She had honored it. She had passed a test she hadn't even known she was taking. Her quiet campaign with Alice was one of observation. She learned the child's secret paths through the house. She noticed that although Alice never spoke, she sometimes hummed a repetitive, melancholy little tune. She noticed the locket, a gold oval Aliesa's hand, was always straying to her thumb, rubbing its smooth surface. One blustery afternoon, Eleanor was in the morning room, trying to coax a little more light into the space by pulling back the heavy velvet curtains. They were a deep, somber green, and they seemed to suck the very daylight from the room. As she worked the heavy pull cord, she saw Alice slip into the room, silent as a mouse, and retrieve a small embroidered cushion from a window seat. The child clutched it to her chest and was about to slip away again when she noticed the change. Eleanor had managed to draw one of the curtains fully back. A wide shaft of pale, watery sunlight now streamed into the room, illuminating a patch of the worn carpet. Alice stopped dead, her eyes wide. She stared at the patch of light, as if it were a magical apparition. "Your mother liked the morning sun," Eleanor said, her voice gentle, matter-of-fact. She did not look at Alice, but kept her attention on the stubborn pull cord of the second curtain. The housekeeper told me," she said. This was her favorite room. Alice did not reply. She stood frozen for another moment, clutching her cushion, her gaze fixed on that impossible patch of warmth and light. Then, as silently as she had come, she turned and fled. But she had hesitated. For the first time, she had not immediately vanished. She had stayed. She had listened. It was a beginning. A tiny, fragile seed planted in the frozen ground of the child's grief. Eleanor let the second curtain fall back into place, leaving just that one defiant column of sunlight. It was enough for one day. But the quiet of Wycliffe could not hold the world at bay forever. A letter arrived from her mother, the pages filled with her frantic, looping script. The scandal was not dying down. In fact, Lord Wycliffe's refusal to break the engagement had only added fuel to the fire. It was now a romance, a melodrama, being played out for the Tonos' amusement. And in this new version of the story, a villain had emerged more clearly: Lady Beatrice Crampton. Lady Beatrice, a beautiful and ambitious widow, who had made no secret of her desire to become the next Marchioness of Wycliffe, was now painting herself as a woman scorned, her good name besmirched by her association with the Marquess's scandalous fiancé. She was telling everyone who would listen that she had tried to warn him about Eleanor's character. "She is poisoning the wells," Eleanor said to Everett, handing him the letter. They were in the library, the comforting fire, a stark contrast to the chill that was creeping down her spine. He read the letter, his expression hardening. "A Beatrice is a woman who believes the world owes her what she wants. She wanted this house. She wanted my title. She wanted you," Eleanor corrected, quietly. He looked up, his gray eyes meeting hers. No. She wanted what I have. There is a difference." He tossed the letter onto the fire. They watched the paper curl, blacken and turn to ash. Lies have no power here, Eleanor. But Eleanor was not so sure. A woman like Lady Beatrice, when thwarted, did not simply retreat. She regrouped. She found new weapons. Eleanor felt a knot of foreboding tighten in her stomach. The peace she had found in the quiet order of the library felt fragile. a temporary truce in a war that was far from over. That evening, a visitor was announced. Lady Beatrice herself. Eleanor's heart leaped into her throat. Everett, who was standing by the mantelpiece, simply gave a short, sharp nod to Finch, a show her in. A Lady Beatrice swept into the library like a bird of prey, all shimmering silks and sharp, predatory glances. She was stunningly beautiful with hair the color of spun gold and eyes of a brilliant cold blue. She feigned surprise at seeing Eleanor. "Oh, Miss Ainsworth. I had no idea you were in residence." Her voice was like honey laced with arsenic. Her gaze raked over Eleanor's simple gray gown, a silent, contemptuous dismissal. "A Lady Beatrice," Everett said, his voice clipped and cold. "To what do we owe the pleasure?" Everett, darling, I was simply so worried," she exclaimed, turning the full force of her charm on him. She laid a hand on his arm, a gesture of practiced intimacy. "The things people are saying. I had to come and see for myself that you were well. This whole sordid affair." She let her voice trail off, her eyes flicking back to Eleanor. "It must be so trying for you." "I am perfectly well," Everett said, pointedly removing his arm from her grasp. "And Miss Ainsworth is my guest. And my fiancé." The word hung in the air, a gauntlet thrown down on the library carpet. Beatrice's smile tightened. "Of course. Your loyalty is so admirable, if perhaps a little misplaced." She turned to Eleanor, her blue eyes glinting. You are very brave, my dear, to show your face after what happened. I do hope, for the Marquess's sake, and for that poor, motherless child's, that you know what you are doing." The mention of Alice was a deliberate, calculated strike. It was a threat. Before Eleanor could formulate a reply, a small sound came from the doorway. All three of them turned. Alice was standing there, a small, silent figure in a white nightgown. She was clutching the embroidered cushion to her chest, her eyes wide and frightened, fixed on the glittering, menacing figure of Lady Beatrice. She had clearly been on her way to bed, and had been drawn by the raised voices. Beatrice saw her and her expression shifted, becoming one of saccharine sweetness. "Oh, you poor darling," she cooed, taking a step toward the child. Come here, Alice. You must not listen to grown-up talk." Elise flinched back, her small body recoiling as if from a snake. Her gaze darted from Beatrice to her father, and then, to Eleanor's astonishment, it landed on her. For a split second, there was a desperate, silent appeal in the child's eyes. Instinct took over. Eleanor moved, placing herself subtly between Beatrice and the child. She did not touch Alice, but created a quiet, physical barrier. Leave, it is past your bedtime." "Alice," Eleanor said, her voice calm and even. A rock in the turbulent currents of the room. "Miss Gable will be looking for you." Beatrice's face contorted in a brief flash of fury at being thwarted. Really, Miss Ainsworth, I think you forget your place." On the contrary, Lady Beatrice." Everett's voice cut in, sharp as splintered ice. Miss Ainsworth knows her place here perfectly. It is you who seem to have forgotten yours." He crossed the room and stood beside Eleanor, a silent, unshakable wall of support. "It is late. I am sure you have a long drive back." It was a dismissal of the most brutal and public kind. Lady Beatrice's face went pale, then mottled with rage. She shot Eleanor a look of pure venom, a look that promised retribution. Without another word, she turned on her heel and swept from the room. The silence she left behind was thick with unspoken things. Eleanor's heart was still pounding from the confrontation. She looked at Everett, who was watching her with an expression she could not quite decipher. Then she looked down. Alice had not moved. She was still standing behind her, clutching her cushion. Her gaze was on the floor. Slowly, as if it took a monumental effort, the child lifted her head. She looked at Eleanor. Her lips parted. She doesn't like the sun," Alice whispered, her voice a tiny rusty thing from disuse. as she always made the servants close the curtains. It was the most she had said in months. It was an offering, a secret shared, a side chosen. Eleanor's breath hitched. She knelt, bringing herself down to the child's level. She still did not touch her. "I know," she said softly. Alice looked at her for a moment longer, a searching, solemn look. Then she turned and, without another sound, padded out of the room and up the stairs. Eleanor remained kneeling on the carpet, the warmth of the fire on her back. She felt Everetta's hand come to rest on her shoulder, a firm grounding pressure. She had not only withstood the first attack, she had, without trying, won her first ally. And in the process, she had given a silent child back her voice. The cold house of Wycliffe had just become a little less cold. The weeks that followed were a time of fragile, tentative growth. Alice's single whispered sentence had not magically unlocked the floodgates of her grief, but it had opened a door that had been sealed shut. She began to speak, at first only to Eleanor, and only in quiet, brief sentences. She would point out a bird in the garden. She would ask a question about a word in a book. Each utterance was a small, precious gift. Eleanor, in turn, learned the language of the child's silence. She learned that Alice's humming grew more melodic when she was content and faded when she was anxious. She learned that the constant polishing of the locket was a way for Alice to feel close to the mother she could barely remember, but whose absence was a constant, aching void. One afternoon, Eleanor found Alice in the library, staring up at a high shelf. "Oh, what is it?" Eleanor asked gently. "Oh, the book of hymns," Alice said, her voice barely audible. "Mamma used to sing from it." The shelf was too high for either of them to reach. Without a word, Eleanor went to find the rolling ladder, her practical skirts making a soft, shushing sound on the carpet. She climbed the ladder, the wood creaking under her weight, and retrieved the heavy, leather-bound book. She did not open it, she simply handed it to Alice. The child took it with a reverence that was heartbreaking. She hugged it to her chest, her small face buried in the cool leather. She didn't say thank you. She didn't need to. The bond between them was being woven, not with grand gestures, but with these small, quiet threads of understanding. A curtain left open to the morning sun. A book of hymns retrieved from a high shelf. A shared dislike of a woman who brought darkness with her. Everett watched it all. He was a man accustomed to observing from a distance, and what he saw now both moved and unsettled him. He saw Eleanor's profound and patient kindness. He saw her instinctive understanding of his daughter's wounded heart. He saw her bringing a quiet, steadying order, not just to his library, but to the very atmosphere of his home. The house had been frozen in grief for so long, a beautiful, cold mausoleum. Now, he could feel the first tentative signs of a thaw. There was the scent of baking from the kitchens again, something beyond the daily bread. He heard the maids humming as they worked. He saw a pot of late-blooming chrysanthemums on a table in the hall, placed there by Eleanor. He found himself seeking her out, manufacturing reasons to be in the library when she was there. He would ask her opinion on a letter from his solicitor, or on a dispute between two of his tenants. He valued her clear, logical mind, her lack of sentimentality, her innate sense of fairness. But it was more than that. He was drawn to her presence. The silence in a room was different when she was in it. It was no longer an empty, lonely silence. It was a comfortable, shared, quiet. One evening, as a storm raged outside, battering the windows with sheets of rain, the house was plunged into darkness. A branch had come down on the lane, and the lamps in the main part of the house flickered and died. The maids scurried about with candles, their faces pale in the wavering light. A clap of thunder, louder than the rest, shook the very foundations of the house. A moment later, a terrified wail came from upstairs. "Alice." Everett was halfway to the door when he saw Eleanor was already gone, a single candlestick in her hand, her face a mask of calm determination as she ascended the grand staircase into the darkness. He followed, his own steps more hesitant. He had never known how to comfort his daughter in her fears. His own grief was a wall between them. He did not know how to breach. He reached the upstairs landing to see a line of light under Elias's door. He heard voices from within. He stopped, listening. Ali and the thunder is only the clouds bumping into each other, Eleanor was saying, her voice a low, soothing murmur. They are clumsy, like giants carrying too many parcels. There was a sniffle, then Elisa's small voice. Mama said it was angels bowling. Well, there you are then, Eleanor's voice came. Warm and gentle. Either way, it is nothing to be frightened of. Just a lot of noise. There was a pause. Do you know the hymn? Forth in thy name, a hesitant whisper. A little. My mother used to sing it during storms, Eleanor said. She had a terrible voice, but she sang it so loudly, you cannot hear the thunder. It goes like this, and then she began to sing. Her voice was not a trained one, but it was clear and true, and full of a strength that seemed to push back against the storm. She sang the simple, steadying hymn into the darkness of the room, and after a moment, a second smaller voice joined hers. Hesitant at first, then growing a little stronger. Everett stood in the shadows of the hall, his hand braced against the cold wall, and listened to his fiancée and his daughter singing a hymn together in the dark. He felt something in his chest constrict, a feeling so sharp and unfamiliar it was almost painful. It was not just gratitude. It was a profound, aching recognition of what he had been missing, of the warmth and light this quiet, sensible woman had carried into the frozen chambers of his heart. He had asked her to keep his ring for the sake of honor and defiance. He was beginning to understand that he wanted her to keep it for his own. He retreated before they could see him, a ghost in his own house, his mind reeling. He had not expected to care whether she stayed. The storm passed. The fragile peace of Wycliffe returned, but Lady Beatrice's parting shot had been a declaration of war, and they all knew it. The letter arrived 2 weeks later, delivered by a solemn-faced clerk from the county seat. It was addressed to the Marquis of Wycliffe. Everett read it in the library, his back to Eleanor. She watched the line of his shoulders grow rigid, his hand clenching the thick parchment until his knuckles were white. What is it?" she asked, a cold dread seeping into her. He turned, and his face was a grim, granite mask. The guarded Marquess was gone, replaced by a man preparing for battle. It is a petition," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, filed with the Chancery Court. Lady Beatrice Crampton has formally requested that the court review the guardianship of my daughter. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. On what grounds? On the grounds, he said, his voice laced with a fury so cold it was more terrifying than any shout. That my choice of a future wife demonstrates a reckless disregard for my daughter's moral and emotional well-being. She claims you are an unfit guardian. She is demanding that Alice be removed from my care and made a ward of the court, to be placed with a more suitable relative. He let the letter drop to the desk. It lay there, a white rectangle of pure malice. She means herself, of course, Eleanor whispered. Lady Beatrice was a distant cousin of the late Lady Wycliffe. The connection was tenuous, but it was enough. Of course, he bit out. The scandal was no longer about whispers and ruined reputations. It had become a weapon aimed at the very heart of their small, fragile world. It was aimed at Alice. They were going to try to take the child. A title-worthy line. They are going to try to take the child. The threat was no longer a phantom. It had a Nymach court date in 1 month's time. A hearing would be held to determine if the Marquis of Wycliffe was a fit father, and if his fiancée was a corrupting influence. Lady Beatrice would present her evidence of Eleanor's scandalous character. She would have witnesses. The lies that had been whispered in London ballrooms would now be spoken under oath in a courtroom. She cannot win, Eleanor said, trying to convince herself as much as him. It is all lies. Lies can be very powerful in the right mouths, Everett said grimly, and Beatrice has a talent for making them sound like righteous truths. She will paint you as a scheming adventuress, and me as a fool, blinded by infatuation. She will use Alia's silence, her grief, as proof of neglect. The terrible irony was that Alice was only just beginning to heal, to speak, to trust. And now this. The court would see a quiet, withdrawn child and believe Beatrice's narrative. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through Eleanor's composure. This was her fault. Her ruina was the weapon being used against them. Perhaps I should leave, she said, the words tasting like ash. If I am gone, she has no case. A no, Everett said, his voice sharp and absolute. He crossed the room and took her by the shoulders, forcing her to meet his gaze. His hands were firm, grounding. That is exactly what she wants. She wants to break us. She wants you to run. We will not give her the satisfaction. We will fight this. Together. His certainty was a lifeline. She leaned into it, drawing strength from the solid feel of his hands on her shoulders. How? By telling the truth, he said. By proving her lies for what they are. His eyes were like chips of flint. She thinks she is fighting a ruined girl and a grieving recluse. She has forgotten that I am the Marquess of Wycliffe, and I protect what is mine. His words were a vow. I protect what is mine. He was claiming her, claiming their shared fight, in a way that went far beyond the legalities of their engagement. In the days that followed, the atmosphere at Wycliffe changed. The quiet peace was replaced by a tense, focused energy. Everett was a man transformed. The weary, solitary lord was gone, replaced by a formidable strategist. He spent long hours with his solicitor, a shrewd, sharp-eyed man named Mr. Davies, who traveled down from London. Messengers came and went at all hours. Letters were written, sealed, and dispatched. Everett was gathering his forces. He began a quiet, methodical investigation into the night of the Danbury ball. He sent agents to London to find the maid who had attended Eleanor. He had them inquire into Lord Ashworth's movements that night. And most importantly, he began to discreetly investigate Lady Beatrice's finances. A woman like Beatrice always has secrets, he told Eleanor late one night as they sat opposite each other at the great library desk, a sea of papers between them. And secrets often have a cost. Eleanor's role was different, but no less crucial. She became the guardian of the house. Fragile, calm, she knew that Alice, with the uncanny sensitivity of a child, would feel the tension, so Eleanor made it her mission to maintain the rhythm of their days. Lessons continued. Walks were taken in the crisp autumn air. The cataloging of the library proceeded, a steady, reassuring task in a world that had become uncertain. She did not shield Alice from the truth entirely. She knew the child would hear whispers. One afternoon, as they sat by the fire, Alice looked up from her book, her small face clouded with worry. Is Lady Beatrice angry with Papa?" she asked. Eleanor chose her words with care. Yes, I think she is. Is she going to make me go away?" The child's voice was a tiny, frightened whisper. Eleanor's heart broke. She set aside her own work and gave Alice her full attention. Your father and I will never, ever let that happen," she said, her voice fierce with a conviction that surprised her. This is your home. No one can make you leave your home. A promise." Elia's gray eyes, so like her father's, were wide with unshed tears. "A promise," Eleanor said, and it felt as sacred as any vow she could make. As the court date drew nearer, the pressure mounted. A letter arrived from Eleanor's mother, begging her to come home, to abandon this foolish, damaging fight. Her father, it seemed, was on the verge of collapse from the stress of it all. The words stung, another reminder of the wreckage this scandal had caused. That night, Everett found her in the darkened drawing room, staring into the dying embers of the fire. He didn't light a lamp, but came and stood beside her in the gloom. "Oh, you are thinking of leaving," he said. "It wasn't an accusation. I am thinking of the cost," she whispered. To my family. To you. To Alice. Perhaps the price of this fight is too high. I. The price of surrender is higher," he said quietly. He was silent for a moment. I have not been entirely honest with you, Eleanor. About why I asked you to stay." She turned to look at him, his tall form a silhouette against the faint firelight. "I told myself it was for honor," he continued, his voice low and strained. "A refusal to bow to gossip. And that was true, but it was not the whole truth. When my wife, when Lenora died, this house died with her. I did not know how to bring it back to life. I did not know how to reach my own daughter. I was adrift. For 10 years. Then I met you. You were quiet and steady, and you looked at the world as if you saw how it truly worked, not just its glittering surface. I found myself wanting to be near that steadiness. I told myself it was a sensible match. But the truth is, I was lonely. It was a confession of such profound, stark vulnerability that it stole her breath. This proud, guarded man was admitting his own deep and abiding need. When you walked into my library that day," he went on, "prepared to sacrifice your own honor to protect mine, I saw a strength I had not seen in anyone. And I was a coward. I was afraid of being alone again. I did not ask you to keep the ring. For your sake, Eleanor, I asked you for mine." A title-worthy line. "I did not ask you to keep the ring for your sake, Eleanor. I asked you for mine." The silence in the room was absolute. The last of the embers crumbled in the grate. He was not the powerful Marquess rescuing the ruined girl. He was a lonely, grieving man who had reached out for a lifeline. It was mutual rescue. "Everett?" she whispered, his name. The sound, soft in the darkness, stayed for the same reason. Before he could respond, she reached out and took his hand. His fingers, long and cool, closed around hers, a silent, binding contract in the dark. They would face the fire together, not as a lord and his convenient fiancé, but as two lonely people who had found in each other a reason not to surrender. The hearing was in 3 days. The day of the hearing dawned gray and cold. Wycliffe Park was shrouded in a damp, clinging mist that felt like a physical manifestation of their anxiety. The journey to the county town was made in a tense, near-complete silence. Everett, dressed in the severe black of a man attending a funeral, stared out the window, his jaw tight. Eleanor sat beside him, her hands clasped in her lap, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. Alice was with them. At Everetta's insistence. She is at the center of this," he had said. She will not be hidden away, as if she is a pawn or a secret. She will be there. They will see her with us." The child sat opposite them next to her governess, her small face pale and solemn. She was wearing a simple dark blue dress, and she clutched the small leather-bound book of hymns Eleanor had retrieved for her. Her knuckles were white. The courthouse was a grim, imposing stone building. As they stepped out of the carriage, they were met with a small crowd of onlookers, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and judgment. Eleanor kept her head high, her gaze fixed straight ahead as Everett took her arm, his grip firm and protective. They walked through the gauntlet of stairs, a united front against the whispers that followed them like a foul odor. The courtroom itself was a large, wood-paneled chamber, dominated by the Judge's high bench. It smelled of dust and old law books. The public gallery was already filling up with the local gentry, eager for a front-row seat at the Marquess's humiliation. Eleanor recognized several faces, people who had once smiled at her, who now watched her with cold, avid eyes. Lady Beatrice was already there. She sat at a table with her solicitor, looking for all the world like a tragic heroine, dressed in a becoming shade of dove gray that spoke of quiet, noble suffering. She gave them a small, sorrowful smile as they entered. A piece of theater, for the benefit of the room, Everett led Eleanor and Alice to the table opposite. He seated Alice between himself and Eleanor, a small protected figure in the center of the storm. "A courage," he murmured to Eleanor, his voice too low for anyone else to hear. The judge, a formidable man named Sir John Albright, with a face like a weathered hawk, entered, and the room rose. The proceedings began. Lady Beatrice's solicitor, a man with a smooth, oily manner, laid out her case. He spoke of a Favara's duty, of a child's delicate sensibilities. He painted a picture of Lord Wycliffe as a man lost in a new inappropriate infatuation, neglecting his daughter and bringing a woman of questionable morals into his home. He spoke of the incidenta at the Danbury ball, of Miss Ainsworth's, a well-known indiscretion. Then he called his witnesses. First, a sour-faced dowager, who testified that she had seen Eleanor looking a far too familiar with Lord Ashworth. Then, two young women who swore they had seen her slip into the gardens. They were lies, polished and presented as fact. Eleanor sat still as stone, her hands folded in her lap, and endured it. She could feel Alice trembling beside her. Finally, Lord Ashworth himself was called. He was a nervous, foppish young man, clearly terrified. Under the solicitor's clever questioning, he admitted to having a private conversation with a lady in the gardens. He did not name her, but the implication was clear. It was damning. Then it was Evertay's solicitor's turn. Mr. Davies, in his dry, precise way, began to dismantle the testimony. He produced a signed affidavit from the maid who had attended Eleanor, confirming she had been in the retiring room with a headache for over an hour. He produced two witnesses of his own, friends of Lord Ashworth, who testified that he had been boasting about a secret tryst with a married woman whose identity he refused to divulge. The story began to fray at the edges, but the core of it remained. Eleanor's reputation was tarnished. Was she a fit mother for a future peeress? "I call Miss Eleanor Ainsworth to the stand," Beatrice's solicitor said with a flourish. This was it. Eleanor stood, her legs unsteady, and walked to the witness box. She could feel every eye in the room on her. She swore the oath, her voice clear and steady. The solicitor circled her like a shark. He questioned her about the ball, about her relationship with Lord Ashworth. He tried to trip her up, to make her angry, to make her weep. She refused to give him the satisfaction. She answered each question with plain, unadorned honesty. "No, sir, I was not in the garden. No, sir. I have no special friendship with Lord Ashworth. Yes, I am aware of the rumors. I am also aware that they are false." A quiet dignity was her only defense. She gave him nothing to seize, no emotional display to twist. The room grew quiet, listening to the simple, unshakable power of her truth. Frustrated, the solicitor changed his tack. "Miss Ainsworth, you have been residing at Wycliffe Park for several weeks. Tell me, what have you done to attend to the emotional needs of the grieving child, Alice?" This was the trap. Anything she said would sound self-serving. "I have not tried to replace her mother," Eleanor said simply. "I have respected her grief. I have opened the curtains to let in the sun. I have given her the space to heal. You have opened the curtains." The solicitor repeated with a sneer. Is that the extent of your maternal care?" Before Eleanor could answer, a small voice piped up from the table. She got me the hymn book." Every head in the courtroom turned. Alice was standing up on her chair, her small hands gripping the back of the seat in front of her. She was looking directly at the judge. Sir John Albright leaned forward, his stern face softening. What did you say, child?" She got me the hymn book," Alice repeated, her voice a little stronger now. From the high shelf, Mama's hymn book. And she sings the storm hymn with me, Anne. And she didn't make them take Mama's picture down?" She pointed a small, accusing finger at Lady Beatrice. She did. When she visited last year, she said it was morbid." A collective gasp went through the courtroom. Lady Beatrice's face went white with fury. She had been undone by a child's simple, devastating truth. Alice was not finished. She turned her gaze, clear and solemn, back to the judge. "I want to stay with my papa," she said, "and with Eleanor Shaz, my friend. It was the declaration of belonging, unprompted, undeniable, and utterly pure. The judge looked at Alice for a long moment, then at Eleanor in the witness box, whose own eyes were shining with tears. He looked at the Marquess, who was watching his daughter with an expression of stunned, overwhelming love. Then he turned his hawk-like gaze on Lady Beatrice. "Ah, I believe I have heard enough on the matter of the child's well-being." But Everett was not done. He stood. Sir John, if I may. We have not yet addressed the source of these malicious lies." Mr. Davies stood. My lord, we have one final witness. A Mr. Hobbs, formerly a footman in the employ of Lady Beatrice Crampton. A nervous-looking man was brought forward. Under Mr. Davies' gentle questioning, he admitted that Lady Beatrice had paid him and two of the maids who had testified to spread the story about Miss Ainsworth and Lord Ashworth. He produced a letter, in Beatrice's own hand, promising him a substantial sum for his cooperation. The trap had been sprung. The lie was not just unraveled, it was exposed as a malicious, premeditated conspiracy. Lady Beatrice sat frozen, her beautiful face a mask of horror. The whispers in the gallery turned against her. She was no longer a wronged heroine, she was a villain exposed and defeated. Sir John Albrighta's voice boomed through the chamber. This court finds the petition of Lady Beatrice Crampton to be frivolous, malicious, and an abuse of this court's time. It is dismissed, with prejudice. He looked at Everett. Lord Wycliffe, your fitness as a father is beyond question. My apologies for this ordeal." He then looked directly at Eleanor. And Miss Ainsworth," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "You have endured a great deal with remarkable fortitude. You have my respect." It was over. They had won. Everett crossed the floor and took Eleanor's hand, helping her down from the witness box. Then he walked to his daughter, scooped her up into his arms, and held her as if he would never let her go. In front of the entire courtroom, the formidable Marquess of Wycliffe buried his face in his daughter's hair, his shoulders shaking with silent, relieved emotion. He then turned, with Alice still in his arms, and faced the room. He looked at Eleanor, his eyes full of a feeling so powerful it needed no words. He had protected what was his, and she, in turn, had claimed her own place, not with power or status, but with quiet truth and the earned love of a child. The room, which had gathered to see them fall, now sat in stunned silence, witness to their triumph. The public humiliation had been transformed into a public vindication. The journey back to Wycliffe was as quiet as the one that morning, but the silence was of a different quality. It was not the silence of anxiety, but of profound, bone-deep relief. Alice, exhausted by her own bravery, had fallen asleep in Eleanor's lap, her small hand clutching a fold of Eleanor's dress. Her book of hymns lay on the seat beside her. Everett watched them, his expression soft in the fading afternoon light. The severe, guarded Marquess had vanished, and in his place was just a man, a father. He reached across the carriage and laid his hand over Eleanor's, his thumb gently stroking her knuckles. No words were needed. The touch said everything. They arrived back at the park as dusk was falling. The house, which had seemed so grim that morning, now looked like a haven, its windows glowing with warm, welcoming light. Finch met them at the door, his usually starched face creased in what might have been a smile. The staff, who had been waiting anxiously, broke into spontaneous, respectful applause as they entered the hall. They were no longer just watching her, they were welcoming her home. Everett carried the sleeping Alice upstairs himself. Eleanor waited in the library, the scene of so many of their turning points. She stood before the fire, watching the flames, her mind still replaying the events of the day. Aliasse, small, brave voice. The look on Beatrice's face. The feel of Everett's hand in hers. She heard him enter the room and turned to face him. He came and stood before her, his face serious, the joy of their victory tempered by the gravity of what he had to say. Eleanor, he began, his voice low. There is more, I must confess. She waited, her heart beating a slow, steady rhythm. I was a coward. He said the words stark and unadorned. For 10 years I hid in my grief. I used it as a shield. I let this house grow cold. I let my daughter grow silent. I was so afraid of feeling anything again, because the last time I loved someone, I lost them. He looked at her, his gray eyes raw with emotion. And then you came, and you were not afraid of the silence. You were not afraid of the ghosts. You walked into this cold house, and you did not try to banish the winter. You simply lit a fire. And you taught me that it was possible to be warm. Again, he took a shaky breath today. In that courtroom, when I thought I might lose you, lose Alyssa, I finally understood. The most terrifying thing is not losing what you have. It is realizing what you cannot bear to live without. He reached into his coat, and his hand came out empty. He looked down at it, a frown creasing his brow. Then he looked at her hand, where the diamond on her finger caught the firelight. I have nothing left to give you. No grand gesture, only this. He took her hands in his. I love you, Eleanor. Not because you are sensible, or good, or brave. Although you are all of those things, I love you because you are the heart of this house. You are the heart of my life. I did not know I had one left. Until you aad. The confession hung in the air. Simple, profound, and utterly true. It was stripped of all poetry, all romance, and was more powerful for it. Tears she had held back all day finally welled in her eyes. This was the final piece, the one she had not dared to hope for. Do not say it, if it is, only gratitude. Everett, she whispered, her voice thick. It was her last line of defense against a hope so vast it frightened her. A gratitude. He gave a short, rough laugh. I am grateful for the air I breathe, for the sun that rises. But this is not gratitude. He lifted her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles, a gesture of such tender reverence it made her soul ache. This is necessity. You are as necessary to me as breath. Marry me. Not because the world expects it, or because our engagement is a fact. Marry me because you are the woman I love, and I cannot, will not, face another day without you, as my wife. She looked into his eyes and saw her future. A future not of convenience or duty, but of a deep and abiding love, forged in adversity and tempered by truth. A yes, she whispered, a yes, Everett. I will. He pulled her into his arms, his embrace fierce and certain. It was not the clumsy, uncertain embrace of strangers, but the deep, knowing hold of two people who had found their other half. He lowered his head and kissed her, and it was not a kiss of passion or fire, but of homecoming. It was a kiss that tasted of relief, and promises kept, and a love that had been quietly, patiently, waiting to be named. 6 months later, the Marchioness of Wycliffe stood in the morning room watching her husband and her daughter playing on the lawn. The heavy green curtains had been replaced with light, airy muslin that let the spring sunshine flood the room. Laughter, clear and bright as a bell, drifted in through the open French doors. Alias's laughter. It was filled with warmth and light, and the sound of running feet in the galleries. The portraits of the ancestors no longer seemed indifferent, they seemed to be smiling. In the main drawing room, the portrait of the First Lady Wycliffe, the beautiful, sad-eyed Lenora, still hung in its place of honor. Eleanor often stood before it, a quiet sense of gratitude in her heart for the woman whose memory she had promised to protect. She was not a replacement. She was a continuation. Alice, her face flushed with happiness, ran into the room and threw her arms around Eleanor's waist. Papa says we can have a picnic by the lake. Can we, Mama? Please, the word, which had once been a distant impossibility, was now as natural as breathing. Of course we can, Eleanor said, smoothing the child's hair. Go and tell cook to pack us the best basket she has. Alice scampered off, her heart full of a child's simple, perfect joy. Everett came and stood behind Eleanor, his arms wrapping around her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching their daughter disappear toward the kitchens. "Are you happy?" he asked quietly, his lips against her hair. She leaned back against him, her heart full. She thought of the woman who had arrived at this house in disgrace, clutching a velvet box like a stone. She had come to return his ring, to surrender. But he had refused her surrender. He had asked her to stay. And in staying, she had found not just a home, but a family. She had found love in the most unexpected of places. She was not the woman who had been rescued. She was not the bargain that had been struck. She was the one who had been chosen and cherished, and who in the end had stayed. Yes," she said, her voice full of a quiet, unshakable peace. "I am happy. What do you think is the truest form of courage? Is it facing down your enemies in public? Or is it quietly choosing to let the sun into a darkened room? I am always so moved by the quiet moments of bravery that change everything. Thank you so much for joining me for this story. If you enjoyed it, I would be so grateful if you would like this video and subscribe to the channel for more tales of love and redemption. Let me know in the comments where you are watching from and what your favorite moment was. It means the world to me to share these stories with you. I look forward to seeing you again very soon for our next adventure.